A man living a quiet life in a modest apartment. Santa Monica, California. The curtains were always drawn, living a predictable routine. Morning walks, groceries, silence. Neighbors knew him as a quiet old man, polite, forgettable, just an ordinary man you'd never look twice at. But for 16 years, he wasn't just hiding from people. He was amongst America's most wanted. His face had been everywhere, on posters, on the news, on the FBI's most wanted list. A ghost hiding in plain sight. His name was Whitey Bulger, a man accused of murder, extortion, drug trafficking, a man who built an empire on fear. But here's what made his story different. Whitey Bulger wasn't just a criminal. He was protected. Protected by the very agency meant to stop men like him. The FBI didn't chase him. For years, they helped him. They looked the other way. They fed him information. They turned him into something far more dangerous than a gangster. They made him untouchable. And when the truth finally started to surface, when the system began to crack, Whitey Bulger didn't run from the law. He ran from the moment everything would finally catch up to him. Because this isn't just the story of a mob boss. This is the story of corruption, betrayal, and a system that created its own monster. If you want to uncover stories like this, the ones history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe. Because some truths are too dangerous to ignore. James Whitey Bulger was born on September 3, 1929, in South Boston, a place where loyalty ran deep and survival often came first. His father, James Joseph Bulger Sr., was a longshoreman who lost his arm in an industrial accident. With the family struggling financially, they moved into public housing, the Old Harbor Village projects. It was here that Bulger's world began to take shape. By his early teens, he was already in trouble. Street fights, petty theft, arrests that came quickly and often. In 1943, at just 14 years old, he was arrested for larceny. That wouldn't be the last. South Boston in the 1940s was tough, but Bulger wasn't just surviving it. He was adapting to it. In 1948, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. For a moment, it looked like a way out. But discipline didn't stick. During his service, Bulger was repeatedly disciplined for misconduct, including assaults and going absent without leave. He was ultimately discharged in 1952 under conditions that were less than honorable. By then, the path was set. Shortly after returning to Boston, Bulger escalated from small-time crime to armed robbery. Between 1952 and 1955, he and a group of accomplices carried out a series of bank robberies across multiple states. He wasn't just reckless, he was becoming organized. In 1956, Bulger was arrested and sentenced to federal prison, receiving a 20-year sentence. He would serve time in several institutions, including USP Atlanta, Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, and USP Leavenworth. It was inside these prisons that something unusual happened. Between 1957 and 1960, while incarcerated in Atlanta, Bulger volunteered for a series of experiments later linked to the CIA's Project MKUltra. The program aimed to study the effects of LSD on human subjects. Bulger later claimed he believed the experiments were part of research to find a cure for schizophrenia. In reality, inmates were given repeated doses of LSD under controlled conditions. The long-term psychological effects remain debated, but the experience became one of the most controversial aspects of his early life. By the time Bulger was released in 1965, he wasn't just a former prisoner. He was a man shaped by violence, discipline failures, and years inside some of the harshest prisons in America. And when he returned to South Boston, he didn't come back to start over. He came back, ready to take control. When James Whitey Bulger walked out of prison in 1965, Boston had changed, but the streets of South Boston hadn't. Crime was still power, and power was shifting. At the time, the city's underworld was divided. On one side, the Italian Mafia, led by the Patriarca crime family. On the other hand, loosely organized Irish-American crews trying to hold their ground. One of those crews would become known as the Winter Hill Gang, named after the Winter Hill neighborhood in Somerville, just outside Boston. The group had already built a reputation for bookmaking, loan sharking, and fixing horse races. Its leader was Howie Winter. Winter wasn't flashy. He was disciplined, structured, and focused on profit. And when Bulger returned, he didn't try to take over immediately. He integrated, carefully. He began working alongside the gang, building connections, proving reliability. Unlike many street criminals, Bulger understood patience. He wasn't just looking for money, he was studying power. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bulger became increasingly involved in organized rackets, extortion operations, illegal gambling, and loan sharking networks. These weren't random crimes. They were systems, and Bulger thrived inside them. By the early 1970s, the Winter Hill Gang was heavily involved in race-fixing schemes, particularly at horse tracks across the Northeast. The operation attracted federal attention. In 1979, that attention turned into action. Howie Winter and several key members of the gang were indicted on charges related to fixing horse races. Winter was convicted and sent to prison. And just like that, a vacuum opened at the top. This was the moment that defined everything that came next. Bulger didn't rush. He didn't declare himself leader overnight. Instead, he consolidated. Quietly, strategically. One of the most important figures in this transition was Stephen Flemmi. Flemmi was older, experienced, and already deeply connected within Boston's criminal networks. Together, Bulger and Flemmi formed a partnership that would reshape the gang. By the late 1970s, Whitey Bulger had effectively taken control of the Winter Hill Gang. Under his leadership, the organization expanded beyond its earlier operations. Drug trafficking increased, particularly cocaine. Extortion networks became more aggressive, and enforcement became far more violent. But what set Bulger apart wasn't just brutality, it was controlled. Witnesses later described a system where fear was constant, but rarely chaotic. Violence was calculated. Targets weren't random, they were chosen. People who threatened business, people suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, or people who simply became liabilities. During this period, multiple murders later attributed to Bulger and his associates took place across the Boston area. Many of those crimes would remain unsolved for years, because Bulger wasn't just building a criminal empire, he was building insulation around it. He kept operations compartmentalized, limited who knew what, and maintained a level of discipline uncommon in street gangs. At the same time, he maintained a public image inside South Boston. To some residents, he was seen as a local figure who looked after the neighborhood, someone who contributed to the community and upheld a certain order. That dual identity, community figure on the surface, organized crime leader underneath, made him harder to challenge. By the end of the 1970s, the balance of power in Boston had shifted. The Italian Mafia still held influence, but the Winter Hill Gang under Bulger was no longer secondary. It was dominant in large parts of the city, and unlike traditional crime families, Bulger's organization didn't operate under the same rules. It was less formal, more flexible, and increasingly, more dangerous. Because at the center of it was a leader who didn't just understand violence, he understood timing, structure, and how to stay one step ahead. And soon, he would gain something even more powerful than control over the streets. He would gain protection. James Whitey Bulger didn't just run the streets of Boston. At the height of his power, he influenced what federal agents saw and what they didn't. And at the center of that relationship was one man, John Connolly. Connolly grew up in South Boston, the same neighborhood as Bulger. By the 1970s, He had become an FBI agent assigned to the Boston field office, specializing in organized crime. At the time, the FBI had a clear priority: take down the Italian Mafia, specifically the Patriarca crime family, which dominated organized crime across New England. To do that, they needed informants, and Bulger was a valuable one. In 1975, Bulger was officially registered as a confidential informant for the FBI. But he wasn't just another source. He became part of what the Bureau called a top-echelon informant program, a system designed to recruit high-level criminals to provide intelligence on rival organizations. Bulger, along with his associate Stephen Flemmi, began supplying information on the Patriarca family's operations. Names, meetings, structures, information that helped federal prosecutors build cases against key mafia figures. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Bureau made significant progress targeting the Italian Mafia in Boston. Indictments increased, convictions followed, but behind that success, there was a cost. Because while Bulger was providing information, he was also expanding his own criminal operations. And according to later court findings and federal investigations, certain FBI agents, most notably Connolly and his supervisor John Morris, crossed clear lines. Instead of strictly managing an informant, they protected him. Evidence presented in court showed that Bulger was warned about ongoing investigations. Potential witnesses were identified to him. And in some cases, information flowed from the FBI back to the gang. This wasn't standard procedure. It was a breakdown of it. During this same period, multiple individuals suspected of cooperating with law enforcement were murdered. Prosecutors later argued that Bulger used inside information to identify potential informants and eliminate them. Among the most significant cases was that of John McIntyre, who was killed after his cooperation became known. Years later, testimony would link that leak directly to FBI corruption. At the same time, Bulger's position on the streets became stronger than ever. Rivals were removed, investigations stalled, and law enforcement pressure, at least from certain federal channels, was reduced. It created an imbalance. The Italian Mafia was being targeted aggressively, while Bulger's organization operated with a level of protection rarely seen in organized crime. This relationship continued for years. From 1975 until the early 1990s, Bulger remained an active FBI informant. During that time, he rose to become one of the most powerful crime figures in Boston, but internally, concerns were growing. Some law enforcement officials, including members of the Massachusetts State Police and other federal agents, began questioning how Bulger was consistently avoiding prosecution. Reports were filed, suspicions raised. But for years, they went nowhere, because the information pipeline was controlled. By the early 1990s, however, the situation began to shift. A federal investigation into corruption within the Boston FBI office started gaining traction. And for the first time, the relationship between Bulger and his FBI handlers was being examined in detail. What investigators found was not just an informant relationship, it was systemic failure. In 1994, as indictments were being prepared against Bulger for racketeering and multiple murders, he was tipped off. According to court findings, that warning came through Connolly. Days before he was scheduled to be arrested, Whitey Bulger disappeared. He went on the run. And just like that, the FBI lost the very man they had protected for nearly 2 decades. The fallout was immediate. Connolly was later convicted on racketeering and corruption charges. Other officials faced consequences, and the FBI's handling of informants in Boston became one of the most scrutinized scandals in its history. Because this wasn't just about one criminal. It was about a system that allowed that criminal to operate. For years, Bulger had used the FBI to weaken his enemies, avoid prosecution, and expand his control. Not by escaping the law, but by working inside it. And by the time that system finally turned against him, he was already gone. In South Boston, people didn't talk. They understood the rules. You saw nothing. You heard nothing. And if you did, you kept it to yourself. Because in the world controlled by James Whitey Bulger, silence wasn't loyalty, it was survival. By the early 1980s, Bulger and his partner Stephen Flemmi had transformed the Winter Hill Gang into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Boston. Their operations were structured, layered, and increasingly violent. At the center of it was money. Cocaine distribution became a major source of income during this period. Investigations later showed that Bulger's network controlled significant portions of the local drug trade, supplying dealers while maintaining distance from street-level activity. But drugs were only one part of the system. Extortion was constant. Local businesses, bars, bookmakers, construction operations were expected to pay, not once, but regularly. Payments ensured protection. Refusal brought consequences. Loan sharking operations added another layer. High-interest loans backed by intimidation. Miss a payment, and the pressure escalated. Threats, violence, public examples. Because control wasn't just about money, it was about reputation. And Bulger maintained that reputation carefully. Violence was used, but never randomly. According to court records and testimony presented during his 2013 trial, Bulger was directly or indirectly connected to multiple murders carried out between the 1970s and 1980s. Many of the victims had one thing in common. They were seen as risks, people suspected of cooperating with law enforcement, people involved in internal disputes, or individuals who simply knew too much. One of the earliest widely cited cases was the killing of Deborah Davis in 1981. Her disappearance went unsolved for years until testimony later identified Bulger as responsible. Another case in vogue, he loved Brian Halloran, who had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. In May 1982, Halloran was shot and killed in broad daylight in Boston. His associate, Michael Donahue, was also killed during the attack. The message was clear. Cooperation had consequences. But the violence wasn't limited to rivals or informants. At times, it reached inward. Internal discipline was strict. Associates who became liabilities, whether due to substance abuse, instability, or suspicion, could be removed. Testimony during later investigations described an environment where even long-term associates were not immune. Trust was limited, information was controlled, and decisions came from the top. Bodies were often hidden. Some victims were buried in remote locations, others were never recovered. For years, many of these crimes remained unsolved, partly because of fear, and partly because of something more systemic. During this same period, Bulger's status as an FBI informant continued, which meant that while local and state investigators pursued leads, certain federal channels were compromised. Information leaked, investigations stalled, and the perception grew that Bulger was untouchable. That perception reinforced the fear, because if the system couldn't reach him, no one could. Witnesses later described entire neighborhoods operating under that understanding. People adjusted their behavior, avoided certain conversations, avoided certain places, and above all, avoided involvement. Even when they knew something, even when they suspected, because the risks were immediate and visible. By the mid to late 1980s, the Winter Hill Gang had reached the height of its power under Bulger. Revenue streams were stable, territory was controlled, opposition had been reduced. But beneath that control, pressure was building. Law enforcement agencies outside the compromised FBI circle, particularly state police and federal prosecutors, continued to gather evidence. Witnesses, over time, began to cooperate. Quietly, cases that had gone cold were revisited, and slowly, the structure that had protected Bulger for years began to weaken. But inside South Boston, the atmosphere hadn't changed. People still didn't talk. Because for decades, talking didn't just mean risk, it meant disappearance. By the early 1990s, the structure that had protected James Whitey Bulger for nearly 2 decades was beginning to break. For years, Questions had circulated quietly among investigators. How had Bulger avoided prosecution while others around him were indicted? Why did cases stall when they got too close? Those questions didn't come from the streets. They came from inside law enforcement, agencies outside the compromised circle, particularly federal prosecutors and the Massachusetts State Police, had started building their own cases, independently, carefully. By 1994, that effort reached a turning point. A federal grand jury prepared a sweeping indictment against Bulger, charging him with racketeering, extortion, and multiple murders tied to his leadership of the Winter Hill Gang. At the same time, an internal investigation into corruption within the Boston FBI office was gaining traction. The focus centered on one name, John Connolly. Connolly's long-standing relationship with Bulger was no longer seen as an asset. It was now under scrutiny. Evidence began to surface suggesting that Connolly and others had gone beyond managing an informant. They had protected him, shared sensitive information, compromised investigations, and allowed a high-level criminal operation to continue, while targeting its rivals. As pressure mounted, the system that once shielded Bulger started to shift. But before it could fully close in, he was warned. According to court findings and later testimony, Bulger received advance notice that an indictment was imminent. That warning came just days before his arrest was scheduled, and in December 1994, he disappeared. No confrontation, no arrest, just absence. When authorities moved in, he was gone. His partner, Catherine Grieg, went with him. Together, they left Boston and vanished. For investigators, it was a critical failure. After years of building a case, after finally reaching the point of action, the primary target had slipped away. And the reason pointed back to the same issue that had protected him for years. Compromised information. The fallout was immediate. The FBI's handling of informants in Boston became the subject of intense scrutiny. Internal reviews were launched. External investigations followed, and the relationship between Bulger and his handlers, once considered a strategic advantage, became one of the most damaging scandals in the Bureau's history. Connolly was eventually indicted and later convicted on racketeering charges, as well as for his role in leaking information that helped Bulger evade capture. Other officials faced consequences as well. But by then, the damage had already been done. Bulger was no longer a local crime figure. He was a fugitive, placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. His case became national. Photographs circulated. Sightings were reported, but none confirmed. For the next 16 years, he would remain out of reach. And the irony was clear. For decades, Bulger had operated within the system, using it to his advantage. Now, he was outside it. And the same system that once protected him was trying to find him. The system that protected him finally turned on him. But by the time it did, Whitey Bulger was already gone. When James Whitey Bulger disappeared in December 1994, he didn't leave behind chaos. He left behind questions. For years, investigators followed leads across the United States and beyond. Tips placed him in Florida, Canada, even Europe. None of them held. What they didn't know was that Bulger wasn't constantly moving. He had settled. By the mid-1990s, Bulger and his longtime partner, Catherine Grieg, had relocated to Santa Monica. There, they assumed new identities. Bulger lived under the name Charles Gasco. Grieg used the alias Carol Gasco. They rented a modest apartment near the ocean, nothing extravagant, nothing that drew attention. And for the next 16 years, that's where he stayed. The man who had once controlled large parts of Boston's criminal underworld adapted to a routine defined by anonymity. According to investigators and neighbors interviewed after his arrest, Bulger kept a low profile. He wore casual clothing, often used hats or sunglasses in public, and avoided anything that might connect him to his past. Grieg handled most interactions. She managed errands, paid bills, and maintained the appearance of a normal, aging couple. Inside the apartment, authorities would later find a very different reality. When Bulger was arrested in June 2011, agents recovered more than $800,000 in cash hidden inside the walls, along with multiple firearms. It was a reminder that although his lifestyle appeared quiet, the past hadn't disappeared. It had just been concealed. The breakthrough came through a shift in strategy. After years of unsuccessful searches, the FBI launched a targeted media campaign in 2011, focusing less on Bulger and more on Grieg. Television advertisements highlighted her appearance, habits, and background, specifically targeting audiences in California. Within weeks, a tip came in. Authorities were directed to the apartment building in Santa Monica. On June 22, 2011, federal agents moved in. Bulger, then 81 years old, was arrested without resistance. Grieg was taken into custody with him. The location wasn't a remote hideout. It wasn't hidden deep underground. It was a standard residential building. Neighbors later described them as quiet, reserved, unremarkable. People who kept to themselves. People you might pass in a hallway and forget moments later. For 16 years, one of the most wanted men in the United States lived among them. No guards, no convoy, no visible protection, just routine and distance from the life he once led. He hadn't vanished. He had simply blended in. Hidden, not by complexity, but by simplicity. On June 22, 2011, after 16 years on the run, James Whitey Bulger was finally in custody. Arrested in Santa Monica alongside Catherine Grieg, the man who had once dominated Boston's underworld was now an 81-year-old fugitive, facing the system he had avoided for decades. The arrest itself was uneventful. No shootout, no resistance. Federal agents entered the apartment and took him into custody. But what they found inside told a different story. Hidden within the walls of the apartment were more than $800,000 in cash. Alongside it, a collection of firearms and ammunition. It was clear that even in hiding, Bulger had prepared for uncertainty. Shortly after his arrest, he was transferred back to Massachusetts to face federal charges. The case against him had been building for years. Now, it would finally be tested in court. In 2013, Bulger stood trial in federal court in Boston. The charges were extensive. A 32-count indictment that included racketeering, extortion, money laundering, drug trafficking, and involvement in multiple murders. Prosecutors presented a detailed case built on decades of investigation. But one of the most significant elements was testimony. Former associates, including members of the Winter Hill Gang, took the stand. Among them was Stephen Flemmi, Bulger's longtime partner, who had already been convicted in earlier cases. Witnesses described the structure of the organization, its operations, and the violence that sustained it. Specific killings were outlined in court, cases that had remained unresolved for years. The prosecution argued that Bulger had either directly committed or ordered multiple murders as part of maintaining control over his criminal enterprise. Bulger's defense took a different approach. He did not testify, but through his legal team, he denied acting as an FBI informant, a central issue in understanding how he had operated for so long. Despite that claim, evidence presented during the trial reinforced his documented role as a confidential informant during the 1970s and 1980s. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. In August 2013, James Whitey Bulger was found guilty on 31 of 32 counts. This included involvement in 11 murders. He was also convicted of racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and drug trafficking. The sentencing followed shortly after. Bulger received 2 consecutive life sentences, plus additional years. There would be no release, no reduced term. The outcome reflected the scale of the case, not just the crimes themselves, but the length of time they had gone unpunished. For decades, He had operated beyond the reach of the law, using information, connections, and protection to maintain control. But in the end, the system caught up. Not quickly, not cleanly, but definitively. And for the first time since the 1970s, Whitey Bulger no longer controlled the outcome. In October 2018, James Whitey Bulger was transferred to USP Hazleton. He was 89 years old, convicted, serving multiple life sentences, a man who had once controlled streets, systems, and outcomes. Now, just another inmate inside a federal prison. Less than 24 hours after his arrival, he was dead. According to federal reports and later court proceedings, Bulger was beaten by other inmates inside the facility. The attack took place shortly after he was placed in the general population. No warning, no time. For decades, Bulger had built his life on control, on information, on staying one step ahead. But inside prison, those advantages didn't exist. Investigations that followed confirmed the killing was carried out by fellow inmates, some of whom had organized crime connections. In 2022, multiple inmates were charged in connection with his death. There was no trial for Bulger, no final statement, no last negotiation. No courtroom, no final speech, just silence. A life defined by power ended without it. No influence, no protection, just the consequences catching up. And maybe that's where this story ends. Not with the rise of a mob boss, but with the collapse of everything that once protected him. Because Whitey Bulger didn't just expose the underworld, he exposed the system around it. If you want more stories like this, real, detailed, and unfiltered, make sure you subscribe. Because some truths don't disappear. They wait.